Okay, now last time we almost finished talking about that great event, the free speech movement, and there are a few points that I forgot to tell you about that I want to emphasize. One is, of course, as I mentioned earlier, the law of unintended consequences. The most important effect of the free speech movement is that it was the first and crucial step toward Ronald Reagan becoming president of the United States, not something any of us had in mind. Furthermore, and this is more obvious, it made Ed Meese Attorney General of the United States because he became famous by prosecuting 800 friends of mine and getting convictions. Hard to do, very hard to do. He did it with an Oakland jury. That's not so hard as with a Berkeley jury. Okay, so there's the law of unintended consequences. Oh yeah, and it defeated Pat Brown, who was actually a rather good governor of this state. All right, but there's some other things I want to call your attention to. One is healthy societies digest indigestible elements by pretending that they wanted to eat them all along. I don't know if this metaphor is going to work, but what I'm trying to say is what had happened to the FSM, a revolutionary movement that threatened the very essence of the society that it revolted against? Well, it's obvious what happened. It became a coffee shop. What could be more harmless? You will find in that coffee shop a wonderful photograph of me in my best suit, standing in front of a sign that says free speech. This was taken on November 20th, and we all know these great days, the 18th of October, the 20th of November, and I can tell you to this day exactly what happened on those days. Anyway, the free speech movement was simply ingested as what we wanted all along, like a big game victory, though it turns out easier to attain. The free speech movement. Another couple of things to remember about the FSM was for the people involved, for the students involved, it was enormous fun. Everybody had a good time. And you can see people having a great time because even when you're suffering, you have to sit in Searle hall. Still, there are a lot of other people around you, and there's collective intentionality and general cheerfulness. The other thing that Jerry Berriman reminded me I should say is, of course, I gave you a formal analysis of how it works, how it's possible to run a successful middle-class student revolt in the United States. And my analysis was independent of whether or not the bad guys were really bad guys and the good guys were really good guys. But on the issue of free speech, the bad guys really were bad guys. They really were restricting free speech on the campus. I know because I was one of their victims. So those are all things to keep in mind. And I'm very grateful for people who pointed out to me that the general principle I stated for middle-class Americans, namely you cannot run a successful student revolt in the United States on bread and butter self-interest issues of the students. Nobody ever ran a successful revolt on tuition or some faculty member who was popular got fired. It always has to be some large sacred issue like the war in Vietnam or racism or free speech. There has to be some large moral question, and then the technique was always the same. It was to tie the local administration to the forces of evil on the sacred topic. The local administration was restricting free speech. They were in cahoots with the forces of racism, or perhaps were racist themselves, or they were part of the war effort. They were part of the seamless fabric of power that stretches right from the Pentagon down to the Dean of Students' office. So you can strike a blow for human freedom by throwing a brick through the window of the dean's office. You think that's too dumb for anybody to believe it? I can tell you literally thousands of people believe that. In fact, I've seen several of them throwing the rocks through the window of the dean's office. There was one day in Berkeley when 2,000 windows were broken in a single day. Okay, so I'm going to leave this topic, and we're now going to go into another topic, namely human rights. But I think it was worthwhile showing you the movie because I want you to see how a system of status functions, which is totally taken for granted, can be completely undermined. And there's another important result about empirical sociology, and that's this. A routine survey conducted by the Office of Survey Research, headed by Charlie Glock on Piedmont Avenue in the spring of 1964, found that 80% of the Berkeley students were very satisfied with their university and with their situation in Berkeley. They were very happy. We have empirical evidence of that. And it was not that the FSM discovered that these people were miserable and oppressed, but rather they gave them an opportunity for a Gestalt switch. They gave them a chance to see their life and conditions under a completely different aspect. And that's what happened. So you can't take sociological surveys for granted. You have to ask yourself, what are the presuppositions and what was the condition at the time? To this day, however, I find Mario's speech telling everybody how oppressed they all were and how miserable they all were, that it seemed at the time to me preposterous and still does. Your generation has a far less favorable situation than they did. The economic situation you face, the job prospects you face, are more unfavorable than they were for the comparable students in 1964, but that's probably a reason why it's less likely and not more likely that you will rise up and revolt against the oppression. Okay, now I'm going to switch gears entirely and talk about human rights. I see, now remember how the course is organized. First, I give you a theory of human society and human ontology. And by the way, as I pointed out, that's attacked by various people already. Colin McGinn has this attack in the New York Review, and I wrote an ill-tempered reply, but I'll put it on the web. It's kind of fun. But I just talked to the guys who edit the New York Review. They said, please make it shorter. It's too long. So I promised to cut it down to 750 words. Anybody who shows how to cut it to 750 words gets an A in the... Well, I don't want to make any promises, but having said everything I wanted to say against Colin, now I got to cut it down to 750 words. And you know, professors are used to talking for an hour minimum, but 750 words, I mean, you can't clear your throat. But I'll do something. We'll get something figured out. But anyway, I'll try, and if I probably get help from Don, I'll put it on the website. If not today, then when I get back from the mountains. Okay, now we're going to go on and talk about free speech. But the organization of the course is I give you a theory of social ontology, and then we apply it to various issues, like the period of student unrest, and political power. And now I'm going to apply it to human rights, and there are various other topics that I want to apply it to before the end of the semester. So human rights, here we come. Anybody have any last word about the FSM or about the movie? Was it worthwhile showing the movie? I think maybe it wasn't bad. It's kind of fun as a movie. I haven't really told you its propagandistic aim. Its aim, really, was to try to get you to feel you ought to do the same thing. You ought to go out and repeat the same thing. But whoever it was said history always repeats itself the first time as farce, the first time as tragedy, and the second time as comedy, and the third time as farce. Anything you did to try to imitate the FSM at this point in time would probably be a farce. Okay, but anyway, I go and look at the dreadful photographs of all of us in the Free Speech Cafe, our enduring and undying legacy. Okay, any questions about that before we go on to human rights? Okay, we're going to talk about human rights. Now, it ought to be clear from everything I've said so far that rights are status functions. As a citizen in the state of California in the United States, I have a right to vote in elections. And I have an obligation to pay taxes. Rights and obligations of this kind are both status functions. And that means they derive from some pre-existing institutional status. And the home of the notion of right is with statuses that are parts of pre-existing institutions. So at the time of the Magna Carta, the aristocrats were not defending human rights. They were defending their rights as aristocrats. And the king was responding with his slogan, Dieu et mon droit, God and my right. The king had rights as a king, and the aristocrats had rights as aristocrats. Now here's an interesting question. Somebody got the idea that there are universal human rights, rights that you have just in virtue of being a human being. And is that okay? Does that make sense? Now, there are two schools of thought on that, and those two schools of thought exist to this day. One school of thought says, of course, we all can see that people have human rights. And indeed, Bernard Williams says, and Bernard Williams was one of the smartest colleagues I ever had, that we all know what human rights are. The problem is to get them implemented, is to get people to recognize them. On the other hand, there are these people like Jeremy Bentham and more recently Alistair MacIntyre who say it is a total superstition. It's just ridiculous to think that there are such things as universal human rights. And the passages from Bentham were so wonderful I couldn't resist quoting them. They're in your book in the chapter on human rights. I was going to bring the book and read it aloud, but you can read it for yourself, where he says, it is nonsense to talk about human rights, and to talk about universal human rights is nonsense on stilts. Nonsense up in the air. I love Bentham because he's so understated, traditional English. He really lets him have it with this particular doctrine of human rights. And Alistair MacIntyre is he's less eloquent, but equally suspicious. He said the belief in human rights is like the belief in witchcraft or ghosts or something like that. It's just a silly belief. There are no such things as universal human rights. It makes sense to say, as a licensed driver in the state of California, I have a right to drive passenger cars. It makes sense to say that, but it makes no sense to say that I have a universal right to free speech, even though it's not recognized in law, even though it's not recognized by anybody. Okay, so our first question is, can we make sense of the notion of a universal human right? Well, formally speaking, I don't see any problem. Remember, a right derives from a status. X counts as Y in context C. And what is peculiar about human rights is that just being human counts as the X term. So if you're a human, that counts as Y, the bearer of a human right. So formally speaking, there's no reason why in this formula you can't count the X term as entitling you to the status. So I'll take a question in a second. As a licensed driver, I count as somebody who has certain rights. And as a guy who passed the test, I count as a licensed driver. But here is a class of Y status functions that accrue solely in virtue of your condition as a human being. Just being a human being gives you human rights. Now, formally speaking, there seems to be nothing wrong with that. It's just that you have to recognize that being human will satisfy the X term in the X counts as Y. But now we're going to ask ourselves, okay, what could justify that? I mean, let's grant that formally speaking, in terms of my theory, there's no absurdity in talking about universal human rights, but still, is it really intellectually legitimate? What grounds can we give for granting universal human rights? Well, what grounds do we give in unproblematic cases? The batter has a right to 3 strikes. The pitcher has a right to 4 balls before the guy is advanced to first base. Now, you can justify those rights in terms of the purpose of the institution, in terms of baseball. It's part of the structure of baseball that the pitcher and the batter and the fielders and everybody else on the playing field has certain rights. Those rights derive from the nature of the game. The rules of the game guarantee those rights. But what are the rules of the game of being human that would guarantee you human rights? That's the first question we have to answer. Yes?
It seems like to me like there could be a formal problem with it if you grant that the X counts as Y and C, it's supposed to be that C, or at least that it sort of represents like an institutional reality, right? But there's no, in C here it has to be all situations ever on
Yeah, that's all right. I mean, it's the limiting case. You always have a human right, no matter where you are. As Americans sometimes say abroad, they're mistaken to treat me as an alien. I'm an American wherever I go. I meant that as a joke, but not everybody appreciates it. But the point is, you're to think of being a human as a kind of universal status, and nobody can deny you your rights. Now, notice a peculiar locution here. People say things like, well, I have my rights even when they're being denied to me, even when people don't recognize them. So even when I'm in a jail in Tehran, I don't lose my rights as an American citizen. It's just these dreadful people keeping me in prison don't recognize the rights. Yes?
Don't status functions, like rights,
Mm-hmm.
always depend on institutional reality, and there's no universal institutional reality?
Yes. Now what there's being claimed is this. It's true that up until these rights were discovered at the time of the Enlightenment, people didn't recognize the reality of universal human rights, but we now recognize that reality. Now there's an interesting historical question. Whoever got this idea, anyhow? And I don't know the answer to that. I cannot find the first person to think that there were universal human rights. Some people will tell you, well, I've forgotten the guy's name. There was a Dutch philosopher, but I can't remember names now. But in any case, what's his name? The Dutch philosopher. Yeah, it'll come to us. Who was one of the first to think there were universal human rights. Now, Marga Vega tells me, well, in effect, the Spaniards had it when they went to the New World because some Spanish priests said that these Native Americans had universal rights guaranteed by God. I don't think that's the same. I think the idea that God hands down certain rights arbitrarily is a different idea from the idea of universal human rights. The idea of universal human rights is that we have a conception of human beings that where it's our conception of us as human beings that guarantees the right. I grant you that in a lot of the sacred document, God gives us these rights, that they are endowed by their Creator, as it says in one of the crucial American documents. But all the same, the idea is it's in virtue of our status as human beings that we have these rights. Okay. So I agree with you. There's something peculiar about these formally, but I don't see that is absurd. I don't see that it's an absurdity in the idea of universal human rights. And indeed, you can say that meeting certain conditions as X guarantees that you're a human, and then as a human as X, you are the bearer of the human rights as Y. But there you still have a question, what's the ground? What justification can we give for saying that certain things are human rights and not other things? And I have to tell you that the public debates about this today are just hopelessly confused. And the confusion, just to look ahead a bit, is there's a tremendous confusion between negative rights and positive rights. And I have not seen any justification for the idea of positive rights. And one of the intellectually most sloppy documents I've ever read in my life is the United Nations Universal Declaration of Human Rights, which gives us a whole lot of rights that seem to me to be very doubtful. Why? Well, let's look ahead a bit and I want to argue certain formal properties of rights. And the basic formal property of rights is this. Whenever X has a right against somebody to do A, well, we could abbreviate that. It just says, use R for the abbreviation, and then the right that X has is X does A. Okay, now, if whenever you have a proposition in that form, X has a right to do A, it must be the case that there is some Y such that X has R against Y. Whenever there is a right to do something, it's always a right against somebody. Legally speaking, for example, if I have a right of easement over your driveway, so the property ownership bill says that I have a right to drive my car across your driveway in order to get to my garage, that means I have a right against you. It's an absolutely ordinary right. The contract law is full of rights like that. It's just not a big deal or problematic. But it's characteristic that whenever X has a right to do something, X must have that right against somebody. Now, what does the right amount to? Well, in the cases that we'll be considering, X has a right against Y, says Y is under an obligation, Y not interfere, this is a typical form, with X does A. So if I have a right to drive across your driveway, then you're under an obligation that you don't interfere when I drive across your driveway. How does it work for universal human rights? It seems to me there is an enormous difference between the intellectual content of the Declaration of Independence and the Bill of Rights, as it's called, where there are a series of negative rights, the right to free speech, the right to assembly, the right to freedom of the press, and positive rights of the kind that occur in the United Nations Declaration of Human Rights. I wish I'd brought the damn thing with me. Google's wonderful because you can bring it up in 30 seconds, and it outrages me every time I see it because they haven't thought through what it means. But they say things like, well, everybody has a right to decent housing and education and health and pensions in their old age and all this kind of stuff. Now, here's the problem. I'll give it to you in one sentence. Universal human rights impose an obligation on everybody. So if you accept this principle that X has a right, X does A, implies that there's some Y such X has a right against Y, and that implies that Y is under an obligation not to interfere with X does A, then if there are universal human rights, then it follows that there are universal human obligations. So if, as I believe, there is a universal human right to free speech, then everybody is under an obligation not to interfere with my exercise of my free speech. That's a universal obligation on everybody. Universal human rights imply universal human obligations. That's a purely formal feature of the notion of rights. But now, suppose you say, as the United Nations Declaration of Human Rights says, that everybody has a universal human right to adequate housing. Who is that right against? It says each and every one of us is under an obligation to provide adequate housing. I guess that means a two-story ranch house with a, well, you don't get a two-parking garage, but at least you got to have indoor plumbing and central heating for everybody in the Amazon basin. Well, I don't think so. I think that's absolutely crazy to suppose that we're all under an obligation to provide housing for everybody everywhere in the world. But strictly speaking, that is the logical implication of the notion of universal human rights. Now, and I think if you take seriously the list of rights they give us about adequate housing and pensions in your old age, and one of the nuttiest things well, I don't want to use technical terms, one of the least plausible things they say is every one of us has a right to a nationality. Suppose we don't want a nationality. I mean, I think nationalities is, as I've told you earlier, the idea of the nation state as the ultimate focus of loyalty that's led millions of people to go out and slaughter millions of people. That does not necessarily seem to me something that we ought to bestow on everybody. But in any case, the list of universal human rights seems to me very sloppily thought through because they have not considered the logical structure of rights. Just to summarize this point, then I'll take questions again. X has a right, X does A, implies there's some Y such that X has a right against Y, and that amounts to saying that Y is under an obligation. Y is under an obligation not to interfere with X does A. That's what I've written on the blackboard. And by the way, all this formal stuff is in the appendix to the Making the Social World. I spell it out rather carefully there. But now, that's okay for the right to free speech. All you got to do is leave people alone. But how about adequate housing for everybody, adequate medical care for everybody? I don't think that those are meaningful claims that you can impose, that everybody is under an obligation to provide adequate medical care for everybody else. Now notice, let me add to that immediately. If the state of California wants to say everybody in the state of California has a right to adequate housing, fine. That's perfectly legitimate as a legal act by a state saying we will undertake to use we as a state will undertake to use the taxpayers' money to provide everybody with adequate housing. It may be intelligent or unintelligent, but there's nothing logically absurd about it. What is logically absurd is for the United Nations meeting in San Francisco in 1945 to say everybody has a right to adequate housing, meaning everybody in the world has to provide housing for everybody who doesn't have adequate housing. That seems to be, that really is nonsense because it imposes an obligation on us which we cannot reasonably be expected to fulfill. Okay, so that's my first objection to the idea of universal human rights. It seems to me you need to make a distinction between negative rights, and there I can give you an argument for some universal negative rights, like the right to free speech. But I can maybe think of one or two universal positive rights. Now, I'll take a question in a second. I just want to get this last thought out, and that is, of course, the statement of the positive right can be interpreted as if it were a negative right. So if I say everybody has a right to an adequate standard of living, that can be interpreted as saying everybody has a right to try to pursue an adequate standard of living. Everybody has a right to adequate housing means everybody has a right to try to get adequate housing. And there I have no objection. Then it's a negative right. It just means everybody's under an obligation not to interfere with your right to try to get a decent standard of living and a decent housing. But I'm pretty sure that's not what they meant when they formulated the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. They think, no, everybody has a right not to try to get adequate housing, but everybody has a right to adequate housing. And that, I think, is not meaningful as a universal human right because it imposes a universal obligation which cannot be fulfilled. Okay, so that's my first substantive objection to the doctrine of universal human rights. Now, there were a bunch of hands up. You first and then you. Yes?
Okay, so I don't disagree that the universal positive rights are probably absurd, but I think that what you wrote on the blackboard
Yeah.
as a logical structure only applies to negative rights, and that positive rights probably consist of a different logical structure where the last line is different. He says why, or that against Y is just some Y. Some Y has the right to provide X with A.
Yeah,
right?
but
So
which
some
Y?
Not all Y. And then that is a problem, but I think it's not that, I don't think
Yeah.
that it has the same logical structure. It doesn't say all Ys have an obligation to provide X with A.
Yeah.
That X must be provided with A.
Yeah.
Whatever Y.
Yeah, but let's think this through. You see, we have a long tradition of universal human rights that goes back to the 18th century. And some of these I think we can make a good case for. I think I do have a universal right to free speech, and so do you. Now, what does that mean? What's the cash value of that? The cash value of that immediately in the United States was institutional. It means Congress cannot pass a law restricting your free speech. But now that's interpreted, meaning nobody can restrict your free speech. Not just Congress, but even the Berkeley City Council or the University of California, that they're all that's applied. But now suppose we want to say, but as the founders of the country did say, that's because there's a universal human right to free speech. Then it seems to me I can make sense of that. That means we're all under an obligation not to interfere with somebody's right to express themselves. We're all under an obligation not to interfere with their free expression. Now that seems to me perfectly legitimate. But now if you accept that formally, and I don't think you can make sense out of the notion of a universal right except as a universal obligation, then if people have a universal right to adequate housing, then it would follow we're all under an obligation to provide adequate housing. And I don't see that we are. Now, if you want to say, no, it's just there is some Y such that X has a right against Y. How do you decide which Y?
I'm not saying it's not a problem. I think it's a problem, but I don't think that a universal right to adequate housing would imply a universal obligation to provide adequate housing. I think it implies an obligation that someone has to provide adequate housing, not necessarily everybody. I don't think it logically.
Then what makes it universal?
Well, the right to have the adequate housing.
Yeah, it means that there's somebody out there who owes me a house.
And I'm not saying it's not a problem. I think that is a problem. I
Yeah.
don't actually think those rights exist, but I'm just saying.
Yeah, I don't think that's going to work because you'd have to specify the someone. If you say, well, look, there's a universal right to adequate housing. Luckily for most of us, it's not a right against us. But somehow or other, they're going to decide who it's a right against. That looks to me, that's in worse shape than the initial doctrine.
That's why it's a problem, but it's the logical structure.
Yeah, I don't think it is. I think the idea of universal human rights is, we've all got them, and we're all bound by them. But if you think that through, you're stuck with this problem. Then who has the obligation? Yes. You had your hand up. Yes, that's okay. That's a negative right. Because that says not everybody has a right to adequate housing. It says everybody has a right to try to get adequate housing. And that means that's a negative right. It means you have a right to be left alone. It's like free speech. You have a right to be left alone to express yourself. Yeah.
The implication of that document, though, wouldn't it be the case that it's only going to be interpreted in this way?
What?
Because they're not going to tell me that I'm going against universal human rights if I'm not going to build everyone houses.
Yeah.
If I prevent someone, then they're going to accuse me of doing
Yeah.
that. The implication of the document, I think.
What I'm asking is, what is the meaning of the claim, everybody has a right to adequate housing? And what I'm suggesting is, unless it's a universal obligation, it is strictly meaningless. Now, Arden's hypothesis is, well, no, it's not completely meaningless. There's a hole in the meaning because it doesn't tell you who. Well, we'll get to that later. I don't think that's going to work. I don't think you can make that fly. But it's possible to take any positive human right and reinterpret it as a negative right. But that clearly wasn't the intention. I mean, Mrs. Roosevelt had a hand in all of this, and that wasn't her style to think, well, we're just going to leave people alone to try to get nice houses for themselves. That wasn't the point. Yes, you had your hand up. Yeah.
So, in this kind of formal scheme, there couldn't possibly be any economic rights.
Well, yeah, there are. I mean, lots of economic rights. Everybody has a right to try to make money. Seems to me a perfectly legitimate negative right. And now, money is too vulgar an expression to use in any of these noble statements, but to better their situation in life. I always understood, was puzzled as a kid when everybody talked about America as the land of opportunity. They meant the opportunity to make money, an opportunity to get richer. And that's why an awful lot of us are here, because our ancestors thought there's more money to be had in the United States. Yes?
So you could have something like an antitrust
Well, that's right. They were not, in fact, based on universal rights. I think the Sherman Act was based on restraint of trade. Now, you could argue, well, but restraint of trade is a violation of a human right. I just am ignorant about the actual history, the legislative history of this. Is that how the doctrine was arrived at? But basically, the Sherman Act was designed to prevent people from restraining trade. But the point I'm making now is, if we're going to talk intelligently about rights, you have to distinguish between negative and positive rights. They have a different logical structure, and I think it's rather easy to justify negative universal human rights. It is it's difficult to the point of impossibility to justify most positive human rights. I'll give you a couple of exceptions in a minute, but even they make me uncomfortable. Yes?
So you have universal human rights, which ground obligations.
Yes.
Everybody.
Yes.
But status functions have to be collectively recognized.
Yes.
So, I mean, isn't it possible that there's some people who don't recognize that right? So
Yeah.
how can you ground an obligation?
Yes, without the recognition.
Yeah.
Well, this is the problem. And the problem is, how do you get people to recognize your rights? I think there is a universal right to free speech, but I have to tell you, not everywhere is this right recognized. I think one of the great inventions of so-called Western civilization is the idea that women have equal rights. It's an absolutely crazy idea. Nobody ever thought of that. When the United States was founded, nobody thought, well, women are people too, like everybody else. No, they didn't think that. They never had the right to vote until 1919, and the Swiss didn't get around to giving the women the right to vote until a few years ago. I mean, well, the Swiss are slow with everything. But I don't know how I got off onto this, but the idea is there's always the problem of recognition, is that you always have the problem of that there are rights that people don't recognize. Now, here is an interesting logical problem. What's the difference between saying people have always had a right to free speech, but it was never recognized until the 18th century, and saying, no, the right to free speech never existed until the 18th century. Now, those are standardly interpreted to be inconsistent, and certainly formally they're inconsistent. One says the right has always existed, and the other one said, no, it didn't exist until the 18th century. And the first one said, no, the right has always existed, it just wasn't recognized. Now, in fact, I think they're not necessarily inconsistent. I think there's a way of interpreting those where they're perfectly consistent. One says the grounds that justify treating human as a bearer of right have always existed since there were human beings. Only since the 18th century has that right been recognized. But there's another line of people who've read my book or had similar thoughts and say, look, if you're going to talk about this meaningfully, you have to talk about collective acceptance or recognition. And without collective acceptance or recognition, there is no functioning status function. But I want you to watch the vocabulary, because the vocabulary typically in public debates is always of the form, we're not asking for new rights, we're asking that our rights should be recognized. Nobody says, well, women have just become human beings. No, what they say is, we've always been human beings, and we were always entitled to these rights. It's just they didn't recognize them until recently. Yeah, say some more.
Just to clarify, on your account, you have to say it's not rights that ground duties in other people, it's their recognition of your rights.
No, I want to say it is the rights that ground the duties, but I have to admit sometimes the rights aren't recognized. And that means they don't function. If people don't recognize my property rights, then they no longer function, but I might all the same feel. I mean, look, who was President of the United States in 1980? De facto, Bush won the election, but a lot of people feel, well, he was not the rightful winner. But we go along with collective acceptance. We tend to take that as our decisive point. Now, Rhiannon here is saying, well, the collective acceptance is what actually makes this thing function. No collective acceptance, no right. But I'm saying, as far as the rhetorical situation is concerned, we often insist that people be treated as having rights even when the rights are not recognized. 3 University of California graduates had their rights violated by being thrown in an Iranian jail. Now, did they have the rights to freedom and they weren't recognized, or really did they lose the rights when they were thrown in jail? I find it more comfortable to say they didn't really lose their rights. It's just that the Iranians didn't recognize their rights. Yes, you're next.
I'm confused as to how you can have an existing status function where there is no collective acceptance. So you're suggesting there's almost like a dormant human right.
Well, I think if you listen to the way people talk, they will talk as if there are rights that should have been recognized but weren't recognized but were violated. If I discover that in fact I own property that I didn't know that I own and my property rights were not recognized, would you say, well, I actually had those rights but they weren't recognized? Or you could say, I didn't have those rights but I got them on the point of their recognition. The point is there's no factual difference in the two cases. The facts are the same in both cases. But because we think, well, look, if you satisfy this term, then you ought to be given the right, we're quite often willing to say, well, the guy really had the right, it's just people didn't recognize the right. Let me go on. I want to pursue it a bit further, and then we'll come back to your question. Okay. What grounds can we give for universal human negative rights? And I think we can. I think we can justify the claim that there are universal human negative rights, even for societies in which those rights are not recognized. And my favorite is the right to free speech. And it seems to me, in order to justify that right, you have to do something that most people regard as illegitimate. You have to postulate there's such a thing as human nature. Now, human nature has become a disreputable topic in social and political philosophy because the notion was used so badly in the 18th and 19th centuries. But if you just think biology, then it seems to me you can justify a certain human rights in virtue of our biology. Biologically speaking, we are speech act performing animals. It's part of our biological nature to express ourselves. And consequently, I think the basis of our human right to free speech is the fact that we are talking animals. We're talking primates, and it's part of our nature to talk. Now, that's not enough, but that's the first step in justifying free speech as a universal human right. But it seems to me that's not enough because there are lots of things that are part of our nature that I don't think ground human rights. If you've ever been to an American high school, God help you, you will find that adolescent boys have a natural urge to beat up on other adolescent boys, usually in fights over adolescent girls. And I do not think there is a universal human right for adolescent boys to beat up other adolescent boys, though there certainly is a natural inclination to do this. Okay, what's the difference between free speech and beating up your fellow male adolescents? And I think the answer is we attach a value to free expression. In short, you need more than just biology to justify human rights. You've got to have a system of values, or as the pompous people like to say, an axiology. I'm not even sure how to spell it, but it sounds like you know what you're talking about. There has to be an axiology in addition to the biology. You've got to regard certain things as valuable, and I think free expression is valuable. Now, that's not to say that it's arbitrary. Oh, well, hell, I like free expression, you like beating up other guys. No, but I think I can explain to you why free expression is valuable, why it's not only valuable in itself, but it benefits humanity in certain ways, that people should be allowed to express themselves. So the ground of free speech is that there should be you have to have a conception of human beings as a speech act performing animals, and you got to have a certain conception of what's valuable in human life, and that essentially intellectual values are important, that the value of being able to think and express yourself is among the things to be most valued about human life. And that is the ground for that I think is the correct ground for granting a universal right to free speech. Now, it's amazing to me that the actual grounds that you're taught as undergraduates are pretty dreadful. I mean, the standard argument for free speech is supposed to be John Stuart Mill's On Liberty, and I think I haven't read it in some years, but it's a pretty dreadful argument for free speech. It says, well, there's a utilitarian advantage to free speech. It improves the greatest happiness of the greatest number if there is free speech. And I think that makes it too contingent. It makes it contingent on your producing the greatest happiness of the greatest number. And clearly, often it doesn't. People say things that are stupid or vicious, but all the same, they have a right to say them even when it doesn't improve the greatest happiness of the greatest number. And the arguments in favor of the utilitarian grounds for free speech seem to me pretty feeble. Mill says, well, unless you they're full of weird empirical hypotheses. Unless people tell you a whole lot of false things, you won't appreciate the true things. Well, that's a strange empirical hypothesis for which he gives us no evidence. So I think utilitarian justifications for free speech are very bad. Now, there's a wonderful rhetorical device in the United States, and I must confess I've used it myself, and that is you can cut short any discussion about rights by citing the relevant constitutional amendment. Why do we have free speech? It's in the First Amendment. Now, you'd be surprised how well that works with the general public. But for intellectuals like yourselves, that's not good enough. I mean, there are a lot of people in the United States who think, what's wrong with slavery? Violates the 13th Amendment. Well, that's not good enough. You got to have a better argument than that. But there is a peculiar rhetorical feature. Now, this came home to me in the free speech movement. What I found, I had to go and lecture to a whole lot of public, what was called in the Chancellor's office the Gen Pub, the general public. And what I discovered was the argument that works decisively with the general public was to say students should have the same constitutional rights on the campus that they have as citizens in the community at large. Nobody has an argument against that. I think that's a terrible way to argue, but I did argue that because it did work. People accepted it. I think the university ought to have its own system of values. We should, if the Constitution goes against us, fine, and so much the worse for the Constitution. But we ought to be able to justify our own values in our own terms. However, what I'm claiming now is that the standard justifications for free speech are mistaken. The standard justifications are utilitarian justifications, and that's never good enough. Feminists point out quite rightly, speech is action, and I'm certainly unsympathetic to that. Speaking is performing speech acts, and speech acts can be harmful like any other acts. So why shouldn't we respect speech acts when they're harmful? Well, there are several reasons for that, and one reason is because there's a special value in allowing people to express themselves freely, even when the consequences of their expressing themselves are quite vicious. Now, another argument is that though speech is action and does have the consequences of action, it isn't like hitting somebody on the head or shooting them with a gun. In the jargon that I hope you're familiar with, the perlocutionary effect of the speech act is up to the hearer. If the hearer is hurt or insulted or frightened, that's partly up to the hearer. Whereas if somebody hits you on the head and cracks your skull, that's not up to you. So speech gives you a kind of option. You can always ignore it or reply to it or just walk away if you find it offensive. Okay, so now just to summarize this, the justification for free speech that is standardly accepted seems to me to be inadequate. And I want to use free speech as a model for negative human rights. I want to say, in general, the justification for negative rights, like the freedom of expression, freedom of belief, freedom of association, is you must have a theory of human nature, and I'm arguing that should be biologically based, and that in addition to that, you have to have a theory of value. You have to have a theory of what's valuable in human life. And those two together will ground your belief or your argument for free speech. All right, now we're going to see if this thing actually works. How about that? Okay, my leading intellectual achievement of the day is I got this to work. Okay, now we're going to ask the question, well, if you said there are these negative rights, give us a list. What are the list of negative human rights? Well, okay, first it seems to me life and safety. And again, what that says is everybody's under an obligation to allow me to live and to live safely. They're under an obligation not to endanger or threaten my life. The life and safety seem to me to be basic negative rights. Now here's one that's more doubtful, but I think you've had enough of this course, so you will know what I'm talking about. That people have a negative right to own personal property. How far does it go? Well, that's a tough question for public policy. I think myself in the United States that the huge disproportions in wealth have created a situation where something ought to be done about it, either by inheritance tax or graduated income tax. But you cannot, it's not a healthy society where somebody can come very close to buying an election simply by spending $150 million of her own money. What chance have you got running against such a person? Okay, but I think the basic idea that I'm entitled to my car and the shirt on my back and the house I live in, I think those are perfectly legitimate. I can make a perfectly legitimate claim for those as universal negative human rights. Now, the one we've been talking about, free speech and free expression generally, so that means the right not only to say what I think, but to publish it. And by the way, it's very interesting to see the effect of electronic communication. And we still have not digested it. We don't know what the effect of the internet is going to be. It's much easier now to get out a blog. I'm not even sure what a blog is, but I talk about it like everybody else. And maybe we should have a blog. I mean, whenever I put something inadvertently on the net, I find a lot of people read it and I even comment on it. So the possibilities for free speech, I think, have been improved by electronic communication and by the internet, though the general intellectual level seems to have gone down. There's some studies done that were in the New York Times on Sunday about the effects on your brain of spending all day long in front of a computer screen doing various imbecilic things. And I don't know, it's a factual question, I don't know the answer to it, but it seems to me quite likely that it's responsible for the apparent decline in the not very high level of students' ability to write term papers. Okay, I don't get me started on this subject. Okay, now another one is the right of association. And again, we're not only Speech Act performing beasts, but we're social beasts. We like to associate with other people, and we ought to be free to associate with anybody who we want to if they want to associate it with us. And then I think the right to, and this goes with the right to free speech, the right to freedom of belief, and that, of course, includes the right to non-belief. That is, it has to include the right to atheism. One thing I liked about the current President of the United States is that when he was making some damn fools, I think it was his inaugural speech, he clearly enunciated the right to have no religious beliefs as among the religious freedoms. Previous presidents have always been nervous about that, and Nixon, I think, said, well, he thought there should be complete freedom of religion, but he couldn't imagine America ever having an atheist for president. Well, I think, in fact, we've had several, but they didn't feel it comfortable to announce it in public. It ought to be perfectly accepted to be announced in public. And then here's one that I think is threatened, and that's the right to privacy. it's a lot of people have no sense of their privacy being invaded when it is being invaded by the amount of stuff that the government wants to know and the amount of information about you that's made available. Even the most routine jobs in Washington. I once served on the board of the National Endowment for the Humanities. Not a very powerful position, I can tell you. But they insisted on more or less total invasion of my privacy. I had to give them all my income tax, recent income tax statements. Why do they care? Well, you don't do this, you won't get approved by the Senate. And it's got to be approved by the Senate. So you have to give up your privacy in a whole lot of areas. And then they cross-question my neighbors. Most of my neighbors don't know me from Adam, but in any case, they had to ask them various questions about my personal life. The neighbors, I guess, had to tell them, either had to invent some fantasy or tell them they haven't the faintest idea. They see me drive away in the morning, and that's about it. But the right to privacy is more or less seriously threatened by various forms of technological and bureaucratic invasiveness. The amount of data that is held about each of us in this room is quite stunning. Now, one reassuring thing, I was reassured by this when I wrote and got my FBI files. You can get your files for 10 cents a page. Some pages are totally blocked out because it's all secret, but I don't have much in my file that's secret. What I found was they don't know anything interesting. They're either not very interested in me, which is probably true, but also they're quite incompetent. Most of the stuff they got about me, they got out of the San Francisco Chronicle and things like that, which was pretty hopeless. Or they cross-questioned students of mine who were paid FBI informers or something like that. So the FBI, if we're trying to run a police state in this country, we're a long way from the Gestapo or the KGB, much less the Stasi, in that the sheer incompetence of the bureaucracy does guarantee us a certain degree of privacy. Now, can you think of any others to add to this list? Well, there is one that I think might be added to the list, and that is the right to a certain amount of silence. The amount of noise that you're subjected to in urban America is, I think, often invasive, and sometimes it seems to me to be. Maybe we should recognize that people have a right to live in at least a certain part of their life in silence if they want to. Okay, now that's a list I came up with of universal negative human rights. How about positive human rights? Are there any? Are there any positive rights that are obligations on everybody to try to actively bring about? I'll talk about that in a minute. Let's take questions about the negative. And also what I want to ask you is, can you think of any more to add to my list? I only got up to, 6 is a lousy list. You got to have 10 or something like that. It has to have a nice round number. But these are the 6 universal negative human rights. We ought to do better than that. Yes? Sorry? Clean air. Okay. Environment. Environmental rights. Maybe they are universal human rights. We have a universal right to have people not muck up the environment. I think I can make a case for that. Now notice something else here, and that is what we list as a right will often be for pragmatic reasons. So by and large, we don't have to list the right to move my arms about because nobody's interfering with that. But if there were an awful lot of people trying to interfere with my moving my arms about, then we might list that as one of the human rights, the right to move your arms about. It's just that's not in question. People are interested only in things where other people might want to interfere with it, as people often do want to interfere with free speech. Yes? Well, okay. Now the universal right to education, how far are we all under an obligation to provide everybody with, let's say, at least the first 2 years of graduate school? I mean, I don't think you can be an educated person without, I mean, given the situation of the BA degree now, you got to have some postgraduate degrees, but I'm reluctant to say that's a universal human right. Now, if you put it this way, how about this literacy? Then, but remember now, these have to be construed negatively. If we construe them positively, then it's harder to make out. Construed negatively, I guess they're okay. Then just the right to try to get yourself educated. Yeah.
Is it possible that there's something in between the positive and negative rights? Like,
Yeah, give me an example.
like free speech, you don't want, not only don't you want to obstruct it, but there has to be some medium like newspapers and
Yeah.
things like that. So for housing as well, it's like you don't obstruct people from getting houses, but you provide the capacity or the infrastructure
Yeah.
to provide housing.
Who's under an obligation to do that? That's the problem. You see, I take very seriously the idea that for every right there has to be an obligation. And if you're going to say so-and-so has these rights, then you have to say who is under an obligation to provide the rights. Now, my question with this one would be, if it's construed negatively, then it seems to me harmless and indeed hardly worth listening. Everybody has a right to try to educate themselves. Well, that goes with free speech. I mean, just to pursue their own intellectual interests. But if you're going to say, no, we're all under an obligation to provide education for everybody, then it seems to me much tougher. Yes? A right to what? Environment, yeah. Well, the point is, you can stay alive, even in Chicago. I mean, even or in Pittsburgh. Pittsburgh's cleaner now than it used to be, but I can remember when Pittsburgh was pretty filthy. But you can stay alive in places. But the idea of the clean people have a clean environment. But now again, we'll construe this negatively, and I guess that means the right to pursue a clean environment. Has everybody got a right for everybody else to try to clean up the environment? That's, as a positive right, that seems to me harder to maintain. I'm going to give you some positive rights in a minute, but let's take questions. Yeah.
Couldn't you just call this list a list of rights that maybe everyone should have?
Okay, now this is the crucial question. Okay, this is a crucial question. It goes back to Rhiannon's question. It's the same question. And of course, the whole point of talking about rights is that it gives you a desire-independent reason for action if you recognize the right. And so what we're asking, of course, when we ask, are there universal human rights, is how should people behave and what grounds for that? But there's a particular force in saying that there is a universal human right, because it means everybody is under an obligation. Now, the problem I have with the Universal Declaration of Human Rights is it seems to me they don't list human rights. Everything should be prefaced with the sentence, wouldn't it be nice if everybody lived in a nice house and had a good education? But this, I want something much stronger than that, and I have doubts about these as universal negative rights. My inclination is to say, well, you don't need to specify a right to try to pursue that. But if you're going to say that everybody that we're all under an obligation to give everybody else an education, then that seems to me much harder to make out. Say some more.
I mean, that's not completely unrelated to what I said before, but a way to construe the environmental right as a negative right could be that people are under an obligation not to pollute.
Not to pollute the air, not to pollute the environment. Okay. Well, this raises a serious difficulty with any of these discussions, and that is, often it turns out that it takes some positive act on the part of society to ensure the right. There was a famous case in Skokie, Illinois, where some fascists wanted to hold a march. And the courts ruled that they had a right to do this, but it was enormously expensive for the state of Illinois because they had to provide police protection, and they had to call out, I don't think they had to call out the National Guard to make sure that these fascists had police protection, that they had armed protection to enable them to exercise their rights to prevent other people from interfering. So the argument against me goes, well, that shows that you don't have a distinction between positive and negative rights. But I think there is a distinction, and the distinction is this. The concept of free speech by itself is sufficient to give you a right. A particular application of that concept may require a positive act on the part of society in the provision of police protection or military protection. But the concept of free speech is not itself a concept of a positive act on the part of the general public. The right of free speech does not as such require a positive act on the part of the state or the general public. Now, in a particular case where the right of free speech has to be guaranteed by some positive act, then you have all these considerations. Is it worth it? And I'll get to those in a minute. Yes, at the back, and then we'll go on.
You disagree with Mill's assessment of utility as a ground for free speech, right? So how do you rank these rights?
Yeah.
Like if one, my right to life.
Yeah.
Yeah, you understand.
All right, we're going to get to that. There are a series of standard mistakes that people make about rights. And one is they suppose that if you have a right to something, then it cannot conflict with other rights. Otherwise, it's not really a right. It's a prima facie right or conditional right. That's a confusion. You can have absolute unconditional rights that conflict with other absolute unconditional rights. It's very hard for people to accept that, but it has to do with the direction of fit. The notion of an ought or an obligation has an upward direction of fit, and you can have inconsistent obligations. The early days of deontic logic all made a mistake because they argued that it ought to be the case that P implies that it not ought to be the case that not P. And that's wrong. You can be under an obligation to do something and under an obligation not to do that very same thing. And intellectually, that's very uncomfortable for philosophers. They say things like, well, then it's only a prima facie obligation, or it's only a conditional obligation. Those are recipes for confusion. It's a typical feature of my life that I'm under an obligation to be at such and such a place, and I'm under an obligation at that very time not to be at that very place because I made conflicting promises. Or I promise people I give a lecture in Stanford, and other people I give a lecture in Chicago on the same day at the same time. Both of these are perfectly valid obligations. It's just I can't fulfill both of them. So as an axiom, this was an axiom of early deontic logic. It ought to be the case that P implies that it's not ought to be the case that not P. That's just false. You often have conflicting oughts. Now, there are various cop-outs, and the standard cop-outs are to say, well, then it's not an absolute right. It's not an absolute obligation. And I used to get this from university administrators, and at the time of the FSM, people would say, well, the right to free speech is not an absolute right, meaning it's okay for me to interfere with it whenever I feel like it. But of course, it is an absolute right as opposed to a conditional right. See, my right to cross-examine witnesses against me, that's conditional. It's conditional on there being a court case. But my right to freely express myself is not in that way conditional. It doesn't depend on my being in a particular institutional situation. But of course, like any absolute right, it can conflict with other absolute rights, and then you have to make a decision. When the right to free speech interferes with the right to life and safety, you have to make a choice, and we have evolved over a long series of battles how to make the decision. If there's a clear and present danger to life and safety, then we will abrogate your free speech in order to preserve life and safety. Now, that doesn't mean that your right to free speech was conditional, or it wasn't an honest-to-John right, or it wasn't absolute. It can be an absolute right and conflict with other absolute rights. I cannot tell you how much confusion there is in the philosophical literature about this. How much time we got left? Well, we got a little time. Okay. Yes, Rhiannon.
Okay, so for something like education or even like the right to a fair trial, these
Yeah.
are construed as positive rights. And I don't see the problem with saying that everybody is under an obligation to contribute to everybody else's benefit in that way. Like,
Yeah.
I mean, we all pay taxes.
Yeah.
So that the government can set up.
Okay, but try to state the positive right. You see, if you say that next time I'll bring it. I meant to bring it this time, and I just forgot. I'm busy looking at snow conditions. The roads look awful. But in any case, if we say everybody has a right to adequate housing, that's one of the things they say in this dreadful list, then state me the obligation that we're all under. And the natural statement would be, we are all under an obligation to provide adequate housing for everybody in the world. There will not very long from now be 9 billion people in the world, and we're all under an obligation to provide adequate housing for all of them. I can't make that fly.
But what about education?
Okay. All right. Now, a fair trial is a conditional right. Now, let me make this clear. You have to make a distinction between absolute rights and conditional rights. And a conditional right is a right conditional on your being in a certain situation. The right to a fair trial, I think, is a right, but it's not an absolute right. It's conditional on your being accused of a crime in a judicial situation. Then, given that condition, you're entitled to a fair trial. But now all of that is within an institutional structure. The whole idea of this list is it's supposed to be independent of any institutional structure. It's supposed to be, this is before you ever get going with things like the right to a fair trial or the right to cross-examine witnesses. Yes, those are conditional rights within institutional structures. Now, when I first started working on this, I thought there are no absolute positive human rights, but I can think of a couple. Let me ask you what you think of these. If I'm walking along the street and I see some guy who's dying, he's got hit by a car and he's bleeding to death, am I under an obligation to try to do something to save his life? And it seems to me I am. That is to say, I think there is an absolute positive right given to people who are helpless, like infants, small children, for example, there is a universal, absolute, positive human right to survival or assistance in a situation of complete helplessness. The infant is helpless. The guy who's injured is going to die if he's not helped. Does he have a right to my attention? And I think that's the only case I can think of where there is an absolute positive human right, the right to life and survival of people who are otherwise helpless. Now, if it's an able-bodied guy asking for spare change on Telegraph Avenue, he's got no rights against me. But if it's an infant dying or a guy who's hit by a car, then I think he does have a right there. I don't know how to formulate it exactly, but it's something like the right to help where life and survival are concerned of people who are otherwise helpless, such as small infants or people who are injured. That seems to me the only case I can think of where there is a universal positive human right. However, you have to be careful about that, because at any given point there are a whole lot of people dying in Africa or in the Amazon basin, and I don't think I'm under an obligation to help them. I think it's only given certain practical considerations, such as the fact that I can actually do something about this guy, that inclines me to say I have a positive, that there is a positive universal human right to life and survival of the otherwise helpless, when the life and survival can be given by people for whom this doesn't sound very elegant when I try to state it, for whom it's practically feasible to offer them some assistance. Does everybody see the quandary I'm in? I want to say there are circumstances when we're all under an obligation to help out. But it doesn't mean we're under an obligation to help out everybody under all conditions. Yes?
But why? What is the justification?
Yeah, the justification for that, it goes back to the two things that I said earlier. You have to have a theory of human nature, and you got to have a theory of value. The theory of human nature says, well, human beings strive to stay alive, and the theory of value says life is valuable. Other things equal life is valuable. Of course, there are all sorts of people for whom it's not so valuable because they turn out to be perfectly dreadful, but that's all right. They still have an absolute right to life. I think we've run out of time, haven't we? We're just getting started on this. Okay, now I want you to think about what we're going to talk about the rest of the semester. Don't snap your notebooks just yet. I have 2 full minutes on this watch, which is the authoritative watch for this course. There are several topics that we haven't talked about. We'll finish up talking about human rights. I would like to explain to you, you see, one thing I want you to get in this course is an understanding of how society works. So you know how to read newspapers and watch elections and stuff like that. And so I would like to have some, a good test case like the student unrest case was the failure of socialism. Why did socialism fail? And at some point I'd like to talk about that. The failure is very interesting because, of course, the socialist parties keep the same vocabulary and the same trappings. I wonder if the British Labour Party still stands up and sings the great fighting songs. The people's flag is deepest red. It's shrouded oft our martyred dead. I know various obscene words to the people's flag. But often they keep the trappings of socialism while giving up on the substance. Why did socialism never take a hold in the United States? Why was there never a socialist party in the United States? In one sentence, home ownership. If 67% of the people live in houses they own, they think socialism is not good for real estate values. Will the value of my house go up under a socialist government? Forget it. They're not going to go with socialism. This is why the Reagan and the Bush administration encouraged home ownership with, we're now seeing, disastrous consequences because they gave out mortgages to people who couldn't pay them. Okay, so there are a whole lot of other subjects I want to talk about. We'll finish human rights next time.